Good morning, friends, and welcome, as I seem to say every week, to this week's Monday evening webinar. I hope all of you have had a wonderful weekend, and I'd like to share a very interesting, to me, topic with you today, a little to provoke us to think about certain aspects of our own expression of who we are in society, for our personal life, and look out and see what is the state of society now in general regards to this topic. And I want to talk a little bit about art and its impact, and particularly a certain aspect of that as relates to Master's mission in the world when he came. And we know Master came for many different reasons, but he came with a very positive message, which I think is very much needed in this age and very important in this age. And it's something Swami Kriyananda emphasized quite a bit. As we know, if you know of Swami's history, and if you had a chance to know him, he was very, very sensitive to art. He was sensitive in that sense that he had a great enjoyment of beauty, artistic expression. He himself tried to express in artistic ways, but he certainly could. But he loved beautiful things, and he attributed it his appreciation for beauty as subtle astral memories from the astral world. And so he could be moved by beautiful music and beautiful artistic expressions of all kinds. And he used to tell this story, but he says, art has more than just, it's just more than just for us personally and our personal enjoyment. Many people just think, oh, I love art, that's beautiful. And it's one of the roles of the artist is to create beauty, to help, to other people. But it's also, there's a larger role also of art, and also beyond the actual role of art, that it's, you might say it's a barometer as well. Barometer for the individual, but also barometer for society as a whole. Now, there's a story that in this regard that Swamiji used to speak to, and he would say, and it's the story goes that in the old days, ancient times in China, the emperor wanted to assess how the kingdom was going. He wanted to know, what are people happy? What are they doing? How are things? Is everything good? Do I need to do something? Those sorts of things. But because he lived in the capital and he didn't know what was going on in the provinces, what he would do, he would send his envoys to the far reaches of his kingdom. And he would give a message to them. And he says, I want you to go and I want you to listen to the music that is being played, the music that is popular, the music. And because he felt that a society itself expresses itself, not just individually, but expresses itself, the attitude of a community, you might say, the attitude of his kingdom was expressed through the music that was played. And of course, it makes you wonder that what would the emperor think today if the emperor through the world you go to is how is art expressing itself? What attitudes, or you could say what vibrations are being expressed through artistic expression today? I don't know. Painting, sculpture, poetry, theater, dance. And of course, you have to look, I think, in today, maybe art is, in the previous time there was a more classical expression, but today you have the popular expression too, which is now very much because of media. You've got movies, you've got television, you probably got you got WeChat, you've got everything, or WhatsApp, and you've got all of the various popular mediums that are also expressing or have artistic expression in them as well. So you have to ask, what's being expressed there, that's reflecting the state of mind on a larger scale. And You could see, and you could wonder, and this is Swamiji, of course, who was sensitive to art. He would shake his head and he would say some of the trends, saying it mildly, were not so good. And art has a special place, and they have a special function. Artists do in society. They express feelings. It's evocative, and it's, of course, we think of art as the individual artist. He's expressing, or she is expressing herself. And art is often think about, why do you do art? It's art for art's sake. And it is that to some degree on the individual level, but also artists are sensitive in that way. An artistic temperament is associated with someone who's a little bit sensitive. In other words, one who can feel and has that ability to express those feelings in a way, either individually or through their craft, if you think of it like that, in a larger way. And it is sort of, you could sort of say it, that phrase that Paramhansa Yogananda used to use. He said, thoughts are universally, not individually rooted. So you think, is the individual artist just merely creating art? Or are they channeling art? In other words, there's something in the ether itself that the artist has a sensitivity to feel that and express that. And it could be quite individual, and much of art is simply individual subconscious art. They're coming through, being filtered through a person's individual subconsciousness, their individual experience. But there's also a larger dimension also. And the artist, or you might say the greater artists, have the ability to express collective feelings as well. Feelings that not just arise in the subconscious or filtered through the subconscious, that you say, but are superconscious. And so the universality of a thought or a feeling or an attitude going through an individual, and if a person is expressing it through the superconscious, then this is the realm of the great artists who have the ability to inspire, and who's in great numbers, and whose work is considered timeless because it's been coming from a higher plane rather than their own individual subconsciousness. And there's a wonderful book, that interesting book, I would say, more Conversations with Great Composers, that was written maybe 100 years ago, maybe more, that the individual there, the author, interviewed great artists, classical artists of that time, and I think Brahms and those sorts of composers. And they all seemed to say this. They said, yes, how do you create art? And the person being interviewed said, well, it comes through me. I don't create the art. I channel out of the music. I channel that. Something passes through me, and that comes from a higher dimension. And that's the realm of the great artists. The lesser ones, you might say, they try to create it from their own individual level of where their consciousness is, which generally, as I say, is mostly from a subconscious level. But the artist has always been, throughout history, to some degree, the great artists particularly, there's a certain aspect of divinity there. And they've been, because one, especially if they have craft talent to be able to express something well, it's a notch above the ordinary. And so there's been a certain reverence for the artists and a support for the artists. In classical times, the kings and the queens, they would sponsor the great artists because and then the artists would express some universal theme on behalf of them, and also on behalf of the society as a whole. And they were recognized in that way. There's something special about them. They have a gift. Now, anybody, of course, who has a gift has also some responsibility for that gift, isn't it so? I mean, even us as individuals, whatever our level is, or whatever our level, even in our daily actions, we have responsibility for our actions. We do something, and just because, oh, I want to be, as I heard somebody say just recently, whatever I do, I just want to be sincere. Well, perfectly sincere in anything I do. And I thought, well, that's good. That's good. But yet, what are we being sincere about? And the artists, you hear that. I want to be sincere with my art. Well, you can be sincere with negative attitudes and very sincerely negative. And it's not enough just to be a good artist and channel something well, crafted well. There's a certain responsibility, and a responsibility to, if not, we don't think societally, we think individually, because we put something out and there's a certain karma there, isn't there? Anything we do has karmic ramifications, and our own consciousness, when we express as our individuality, our life in the world at large, we have to take responsibility for that. And what we do bounces back and reinforces our own attitudes. And so art does that on a larger level as well. And so the artist has that ability, you could say, that special ability to be able to invoke feelings individually. Nice painting, you go see it and you just feel uplifted. But there's also, and that's an aspect. So let's take popular art, movies, television, things that are in the media around us. Those things have power. We know that they have a power to move people. They have a power to influence people's attitudes. And so there has to be some responsibility there on the behalf of whoever is creating something. And some people dismiss that idea, but nevertheless, I think it's more important than that, not to just dismiss. And so we have to ask ourselves, what am I invoking through my own individual life? And so take responsibility to that. And also the artists, I would hope, take some responsibility. But whether or not they do, there is also in art that we look and see what art is like and what's happening in art today in society. That goes beyond just the individual, because art is an expression, as the emperor in China was saying, it's an expression of societal attitudes, things that are happening in society. So the question here is, you might be asking, why am I bringing up this subject? Well, if you were at the book fair, attending online book fair over the recent weekend, I spoke to something, how Master came to incarnate in this age. He came with a message. He came with many missions, and it applies on all different levels. And one of those missions was to uplift society. His whole mission, you might think of as an expression of art. And he brought, at a time when society seems to be being dominated by certain trends and attitudes, he brought a positive message that was an intentional part of his mission, and why he and other masters came when he did. And I say this because there is a certain attitudes in society that perhaps we're not even consciously aware of. And they're philosophical, they have a philosophical context that I'd like to mention. And in the philosophical tradition, there's a tradition of philosophy and an approach to life, which is called nihilism. Now, nihilism is not a common word. Most people don't use it in their vocabulary, and a lot of people don't even know what it is. But it's a manifestation, it's a characteristic way of approaching life that has taken root, particularly in modern society, for lots of different reasons. And it's important to understand this, and especially if we have influence in society, but certainly influence within ourselves. And I think Master's mission was to counter this trend. And I'd like to define, I'll read some definitions here of nihilism so that we understand what it is I'm speaking to. And a definition here, these are dictionary definitions. It says nihilism is a philosophy that rejects general or fundamental aspects of human existence, such as objective truth, knowledge, morality, values, or meaning. In other words, in that definition, there's no objective truth. There's no truth at all. It's all relative, you might say. There's no Sanatana Dharma. I mean, that's just one person's conception of what this world is about. There's nothing fundamental. It's subjective. There's nothing objective. Now, we know this reality is to some degree that it is not as we seem, but to say that there's no underlying meaning, there's no underlying value or direction or purpose is to take it too far. And it may not be obvious to us, but to say that it's meaningless is another matter altogether. And this is one of the characteristics of nihilism, that life has no meaning, it has no purpose, and therefore many consequences come from that, as I'll explain in another definition here. And another definition is nihilism is the belief that all values are baseless. Again, this is from the dictionary, and that nothing can be known or communicated. In other words, everything is subjective. Nothing can be really known because nothing real. There is no reality, so you can't communicate it. And to go on, it is often associated with extreme pessimism and a radical skepticism that condemns existence. A true nihilist could believe in nothing, have no loyalties, no purpose other than perhaps an impulse to destroy. And this actually was and has continued to be prevalent in certain movements today, and it's certainly in the past. The Russian Revolution arose out of an influence of a strong nihilistic philosophical background in those days. And you go back to Nietzsche and German philosopher and others who followed him, Jacobi, it was philosophy inspiring the French Revolution. These trends began to come in the 19th century into the early 20th century for a lot of different reasons, which we can explore. And finally, one final one here that applies a little bit more to what we see going on in society today. Third definition is nihilism is holds that existing social and political institutions must be destroyed in order to clear the way for a new state of society and employing extreme measures, including terrorism and assassination. Now, it's pretty grim, don't you think? But you can see it playing out. ISIS, for example, today, they don't seem to have a positive vision of future. It's an emphasis on terrorism and destruction, taking down the world order. And of course, you look back, this was the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, had an undertone of that. Now, there are positive messages or hopes expressed in any social movement, an ideal utopia in the future, perhaps being one of them. But the emphasis is on the negative in a nihilistic outlook. And if you were to, there's a word, it's a bit of a new word, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, in artistic movement today, in literature, youth literature particularly, which unfortunately, but particularly, and also in movies. It's called Grimdark. It's a way of describing attitudes, the modern attitudes, a grimdark. It's grim and it's dark. The popularity in some modern literature, I don't want to overstate this, but some modern artistic movements of the future is grim. So it's characterized by very grim, dark tones. And in literature, the fascination that you find in certain genres of literature of dystopia. The future is, everything's falling apart. And you can see this sort of this pessimism sometimes expressed, even in popular culture. Everything's bad, everything's grim, and the future is no good. And what is the result of that? An attitude. You have an attitude such as that, and there's a certain sense of despair, certain a pessimistic, despairing look toward the future. In the individual, it's depressing. And you find you can get into that darkness, and it does lead to consequences. And this is what art is a medium that can express this, particularly what you have now. I wouldn't say high fine art necessarily expresses that so much, but certainly in popular art, the mediums that influence people. Now you might say, well, I'm overstating this, but yet movements in society, they may not be conscious, but underneath, attitudes express themselves in the individual. People don't know why they have a certain attitude, why they do certain actions, but there are certain deep, subtle forces within them that they have chosen to associate with. And they're negative. They're negative. And society is influenced as well by that. In different ages, different things have motivated societies in certain directions. And I think we have to take this responsibly. And now, what does this have to do with us? Well, we're part of that society. And each of us are artists in our own way. Now, I think you could look for the causes to this societally, and you might think, oh, this is a Western philosophical tradition. But believe me, everything that happens today, we're a world society today. Do you remember when Swami, he once said, he was asked, he had come to India in the 1950s, early 60s, and then he came back. He visited India many times, but he came back and stayed in India in the 2003 it was, and stayed in India much of his life after that, going back and forth. And he was asked by a person, oh, Swamiji, you were here in India back in 30, 40 years ago. Have you seen any change? You used to meet lots of saints in those days. Do you see those saints today? And Swami said, no, I don't. And I have seen a change. There seems to be much less spirituality in India today in the 21st century than what I saw 40 years ago. Saints seem to me to be more common, or at least he ran into them and his path crossed theirs. And the person he was speaking with had a bit of a, that wasn't a popular thing to say. But Swami said, but it's okay. It's okay. The rise of materialism has been very dramatic in India over the last half century, since its independence from Great Britain, and he said, but it's necessary, and it's only a phase. And that rise of materialism has greatly impacted the West and has led to a lot of suffering. He says, it perhaps would to some degree in India too, but India has an underlying strata of religious belief and spirituality and faith that will resist it in the long run. He says, but it is going through a time of great material growth. And he says, this is necessary for India to take its place in the world. But he says, but it's temporary. But nevertheless, it does have an influence. And in the West, of course, it's had a tremendous influence. And you find it's the rise of science, which is a necessary thing. Again, this is somewhat of a necessary phase because we're moving from one age into another age. And the rise of science is correlated with the decline of spiritual religion, or traditional religion, let me say, it's traditional ritualistic religion in the West. People no longer are satisfied with belief. They want something more, but what do they have to believe in? That's the problem. Positive alternatives have been few and far between, and art serves a function, you might say, to give a positive alternative, to inspire, as the traditional role of art has been. But at the same time, art is powerful, and it can have a role that can also depress. And you could say, well, it's merely reflecting the attitudes of the age. Well, that's true, but to merely reflect is not great art. Great art also inspires. And I think it has, all artists, to whatever degree, have a responsibility. And all of us, to some degree, also must consider ourselves to be artists. We're artists of our own life, and we have the ability merely to reflect what's going on around us. But don't we also have a responsibility to be great artists in that sense of, in the sense that of being a channel that actually inspires and gives a positive direction and not merely reflects trends? And although nihilism is particularly a philosophy that seems to, it's been, I mean, it's not, you go back in history and you can find, it's nothing new in this world. It just manifests in a little more strongly within, over the last few centuries. But history is like a wave. You know, there's a beginning of the wave, then there's the, you know, the top of the wave, and then the bottom end of the wave. And I think these waves appear in the world, and they have to appear somewhere. A wave of consciousness appears, and perhaps that wave is struck because the science in the West first, because the rise of modern science, not ancient science, we know there were past waves, but modern waves of material science seems to have hit the shores of human consciousness in the West first. But that wave is now passing throughout the entire world, the higher part of that wave. And so the world as a whole is influenced by a materialistic consciousness. This world, you could say, some of the characteristics, you might say, of it, of that wave is that has core, it's not, science isn't at fault, you might say. It's just science is what it is. Material science is what it is, but it does have an impact. And see, you see, science answers the question of what, looks at this reality, says, what is this reality? And it also it tries to explore how, what is it? How did it get this way? Why is this, what is this universe? How did this universe come into existence? But science really doesn't answer the question of why. Is there a purpose? You see, science can't answer that. And that, as it's knocked out the pillars of traditional ritualistic religion, it also has knocked out that foundation a little bit of what is the purpose of this life in general? Is there a direction? Evolution seems to be working, but you could say there's no purpose to any of it. And a life without purpose is grim. And if you have a chance, there's a good book to read. I was going to say wonderful, but that's overstating it. It's a good book. And it was by Viktor Frankl. What was the title? He was in a concentration camp in World War II. And he wrote about the necessity in life for meaning, the search for meaning. And he noticed in his experience in concentration camp that some survived better than others. And those who lost the sense of purpose, they gave up, because it was a grim environment all around. Those who seemed to be able to survive better than others were those who could find purpose in life. Now, Viktor Frankl, he was an inmate too, and he had been a psychologist, and so he was attuned to these sorts of things. And so he spent his time in the concentration camp trying to give meaning in any way possible. You know, when a person, one fellow inmate wanted to give up and was just going to let it go and give up his life and succumb. But he would say to him, you have a daughter, right? She and her daughter was free, was elsewhere in another country with in the UK, I believe. Think of her. Isn't that going to be nice when you see her again? Live for her. There was another fellow scientist who had he encouraged. He says, remember those insights, those papers that you were going to write before the war started? You never had a chance to do them. Soon, when this war's over, you can write those, you can express those, and whatever, these very simple ways he would go and inspire each individual according to their need in life, trying to give them some sense of purpose to hold on to. I'm going to live for this. And he then from this expanded it into a larger, you could say, a philosophy of psychology, is the search for meaning. And life without meaning is grimdark. But it's the purpose, you could say, of religion. Sometimes people might say it's a philosophy, metaphysics, to answer the question, not of what and how, which is the realm of material science, but of why. That's what science can't answer. And so because it cannot answer that, you could say it's subjective, it dismisses it and say, well, there is no why. And the consequence of that gives rise, because it's an impulse within every individual to want to know why. We ask the question, why is this universe here? Why am I born? Why do I have the troubles that I have? Why did that happen or this happen? It's a natural impulse of the soul to ask why, but science can't answer that in the macro sense. And so we fill it. Other things, there's other consequences. And that's the realm of materialism. I've searched for happiness, as Master said, the eternal quest for happiness that's within the human soul, or the avoidance of suffering. And so you find the rise of hedonism. I'll find my meaning through pleasure. Since nothing matters, why not just enjoy ourselves, pleasure and the senses? You have hedonism as a expression, and you see this in modern society. See it expressed in art also, as you could see it, or you find gives rise to a secular spirituality. Humanism has a lot of value, of true, but humanism places man at the center of the universe, and which seems logical, maybe. You know, there's nothing else exists, so man is the center, my happiness, my fulfillment. Well, it's certainly better than nothing, but it takes God out of the equation. God is the center of the universe if we truly understand, not man. And so you have careerism. My career is the meaning. My family is the meaning of my life. There's, as I mentioned, physicalism, the spirit, scientific materialism. Everything is physical. Secularism, only the temporal universe of the ordinary sense experiences is real. And so these sorts of ways of thinking, they have an expression, a general malaise, you might say, a sense of meaninglessness can be expressed in despair, pointlessness. Now, I'm overstating this, and people say, well, I don't necessarily feel that way. And it's true, not everybody succumbs to this. And it's not even conscious all the time on a society, but you see trends like the emperor was looking for and expressed through artistic expression. And if you listen to popular music, popular music has it just makes us happy maybe, and it's a catchy tune, but it also expresses a certain shallowness also. It doesn't inspire. Now, some music actually does, even popular music can be very inspirational in a sense of expansive, not just inspirational of a good feeling, a sense of real expansion, spiritual expansion. And that is the goal of art. And I would hope that that ideal is there in everyone who's an artist, and each of us are artists in our own way. Now, you may be thinking, oh, I got to be thinking of grand purposes when I do a little drawing. I'm not going that far. But on a societal level, when we add it all up, there are some of us who do have potential to move other people greatly. Swami tried to embody this in his music and whatever he did, even his writing, even his speaking, whatever he did, he saw that there's a responsibility to the individual to try to uplift. And we begin by uplifting ourselves, because our outward expression is just but a reflection of what's going on within each one of us. And so you find, and I don't want to criticize positive outward alternatives. I guess I am criticizing a little bit, only to the degree that there's a limitation. They're not the end. And so you can find, I mentioned humanism and environmentalism, the wish for a utopia in this world. There is no utopia in this world, but underneath them, there's a certain ideal. And even when Swamiji started cooperative communities, he said, people say, oh, we're going to create the perfect community. He says, there's no such thing as the perfect community. It's just that some ways are a little bit better than other ways, that they create an environment to allow us to do as individuals what we really want to do, to find God. He says, we have to go back to the true purpose. And this is what's, you might say secular religions, self-actualization, you might say, or even things, if I reduce all stress in my life, then I'll be happy. Hatha yoga, if done simply for a good, healthy body, all of these things, they're good, but they're limited. And so we need to, if there's, the foundation has to be there for all of these movements to find their potential and be seen as channels to something higher. And so we don't want to throw out good things. What we're saying is, let's take the good things, good movements in this world, but let's underpin them with something that's solid, that's going to take us in a direction. Life has meaning and purpose. It's not enough to just say that. We have to be able to supply that purpose in whatever way we can. And we can't really do that unless we find that individually. The artist, we as the artist, must discover that substrata of what is the purpose of life? What's the purpose of my life? What meaning do I find in my life? And if it's only despair, then we're going to express that to some degree. And our lives certainly are not going to be moving in a direction toward fulfillment or happiness. So we have that responsibility to ourselves, but I'm thinking also societally, we have that. And this is what I think, my opinion, is one of the missions of our masters was to awaken these fundamentals within every individual, but also to societally, in a larger frame, provide a framework of purposefulness in this world, to show that life does have a purpose. There is meaning, there is direction, and there is a pathway for each individual to be able to discover that for themselves. You can't just announce it. You have to then also give people tools to be able to accomplish and walk that path. So Master, his gurus, they provided a message of Sanatana Dharma and brought tools to be able to allow that to be within the society as a whole. And whereas before we looked to God on the altar, you might say societally, through religion, We place flowers on the altar, that God is out there, God's in the sky. But that message was encapsulated, that master brought is encapsulated in that phrase in the Bible, neither shall they say, lo here or lo there, for behold, the kingdom of God is within you. So it's an ancient message. That's what Christ said. The kingdom of God is within you. And the time now is for us to discover that kingdom. And Master brought the keys to that kingdom through various techniques. But techniques need also an underpinning of philosophy and worldview in order to understand, why are we doing these things? What's the direction? What's the pathway? And I think that applies to us individually, but also there's an important message here for society as a whole. And Master came to provide, you could say, an antidote to the disease of despair. And he provided hope, in other words, possibility of bliss. And I know when I read that autobiography, that was the message I came away. I didn't understand it, but I felt hope, because I looked back and I was wandering. I was looking for something. I couldn't find it. And of course, if you look and you look and you look and you can't find something, inevitably you become despairing. Oh, it's helpless. I'm hopeless. I can't find it. But thank God I was brought to that message of the masters, and I felt, that's what I felt, hope. Then it was up to me to take it the next step and do something about it. That love is the answer to despair. Love is the answer to a purposeless existence. When we love, and I think that must be, I wonder, those fellows that are terrorists, those guys, remember those guys coming in that boat into Mumbai, what was that, 15 years ago, or whatever it was, did they feel love? Because if you love, and you really know love, you know there's a purpose to love. You're not going to be a terrorist and callously approach life in that way, no matter what your underlying philosophy might be. You're going to love. Bliss in motion is the way Swami described love. And in love, we understand life's purpose. Love, even on the individual level, it gives meaning to life. And in the embrace of love, you could say, how is despair possible? Even it's on the individual level, even human love is just but a spark of something more divine. And from purpose, if you have it, comes action and inspiration to put something in motion. That idea of fighting against darkness, this is even in the Bhagavad Gita, this idea is expressed, the idea of fighting against darkness while clinging to that idea that there's something that spans all, and that's something greater. And this idea spans all ages and all cultures, and expressed in literature and epics, in great art, that aspiration, that quest of the individual soul for meaning. And I think this is what we need to encourage in the future. And I'm happy to say, I think the positives here, I don't want to leave anybody in despair, but I think all of these things are these passing fads, because like I was saying, before I found Master through the autobiography, I was in somewhat of a state of despair. And I think that state of despair, because I couldn't find meaning, draws to it answers. And I think each individual, you find artists now, this grimdark literature, it's just a cry in the darkness. It's crying for something. And it's an expression that I want something. And God responds to the individual. If we cry, the mother comes and helps us. And I think that is coming. And you find that every movement in whatever direction stimulates a counter movement in reverse. And so that grimdark, you might say, movement is inspiring a counter movement of another generation come say, wait a minute, there's hope also. And I think you're going to see this rebound in the decades ahead, even expressed in art. The effort, people say, I don't, because it doesn't bring us happiness. I don't want that. You know, I can only wallow in darkness for so long until you start saying, I got to get up and do something positive. I got to go out into the sun. You know, I can't just be sitting here in the darkness. And I predict at least, that we'll begin to see the stirrings of that in the years to come here, in out of perhaps the difficulties, whatever it is that the world is going through with terrorism and these sorts of things. Maybe even this COVID is just an expression of darkness that takes form in this fashion. Out of darkness will come light. It's there already, but we perhaps don't see it, but it'll begin to spring forth. And I think it'll come forth particularly through the artists. You see, because art, and a popular art as well as classic, the artists are drawing on, and they see on a subtler level, each one individually and then collectively. I think you'll begin to see a trend begin to develop that counters the popularity of darkness. Something positive will start to come. A generation maybe needs to pass, maybe 2 generations, who knows? But I think that ultimately will be the case. So take these thoughts, please take them, and I hope to see you again next Monday. If you have any questions, again, like always, put them in the chat box and Bara will pass them on to me. And so I might look there. It says, what do we do if our meaning of life clashes with your birth and you know, that's a very particular situation, and I'm not going to answer that today, but I do appreciate the question because I might weave that in, that question there. If you see it in the chat box, I try to weave it into a future discussion. So God bless all of you. Ciao to you.